A woman who fell from the sky and lived. 33,000 feet. That's roughly 6 miles above the Earth. The temperature outside? -60 degrees Fahrenheit. The air pressure? So thin, the human body begins to shut down within seconds. Now imagine, a woman falls from that height. No parachute. No protective gear. Nothing between her and the ground below but 6 miles of open sky. She hits the earth. And then, she opens her eyes. I want you to stop whatever you're doing right now. Because what I'm about to tell you is not a movie. This is not CGI. This is not a dramatization. Every single word you are about to hear is documented, investigated, and verified by scientists, aviation experts, and medical professionals who themselves admitted they had no rational explanation for what happened. This is the story of a woman who fell from the sky and lived. But before we go any further, and trust me, you do not want to miss a single second of what comes next, if you are new here, hit that subscribe button right now. Because this channel is where we go deep into the stories the world forgot to tell. Stories that shake your understanding of what it means to be human. Stories that make you question everything you think you know about life, death, and the invisible line between them. And if you've been here before, you already know. Drop a like on this video right now. It helps more people find stories like this one. And I want to hear from you in the comments. I'll be asking you questions throughout this story, real questions, because some of what you're about to hear has never been fully explained, and I genuinely want to know what you think happened. Are you ready? Let's go. Let me paint you a picture. It's January 26, 1972. The Cold War is not just a political concept, it's a daily reality. The world is divided, tense, suspicious. Czechoslovakia, a country tucked into the heart of Central Europe, is living under the shadow of Soviet control. The Prague Spring of 1968, that brief, hopeful window of political reform, has been crushed. The people are watched. The borders are controlled. And yet, despite all of this tension and surveillance, ordinary life still continues. People still go to work. Children still go to school. And planes still fly. On this particular January morning, JAT Yugoslav Airlines Flight 367 takes off from Copenhagen, Denmark, heading toward Zagreb, Yugoslavia. It's a routine flight. Passengers settle into their seats. Flight attendants move through the cabin. The aircraft climbs to cruising altitude, 33,000 feet, and everything appears completely normal. But here's where I want you to pay attention. Because on this flight, there is a 22-year-old flight attendant named Vesna Vulović. She is young, dark-haired, ambitious. She had only become a flight attendant because she was a massive fan of the Beatles and thought working for an airline might help her travel to England to see them. That detail alone tells you something about who she was: spontaneous, spirited, full of life. She had actually not even been scheduled to work this flight. There was a mix-up with another flight attendant who shared her name. A clerical error. A bureaucratic accident. And that accident, that simple, mundane paperwork mistake, is what placed Vesna Vulović on Flight 367 on January 26, 1972. Think about that for a moment. A name mix-up. That's the thing that changed everything. Now, for the passengers on Flight 367, the flight is uneventful in the early stages. The plane cuts through the winter sky over Germany. Below, the landscape of Europe passes quietly. Frozen rivers, snow-dusted forests, small towns with their lights flickering in the gray morning. And then, somewhere over Czechoslovakia, something goes catastrophically wrong. Now, I'm not going to tell you exactly what happened to that aircraft just yet. Because the truth of what brought down Flight 367 is itself one of the most controversial, debated, and politically charged aviation mysteries of the 20th century. And if I give it to you now, you'll think you understand the story. But you don't. Not yet. What I will tell you is this. In a matter of seconds, without warning, without any distress call, without any indication from the crew that anything was wrong, Flight 367 ceased to exist as a functioning aircraft. 33,000 feet above the earth, the plane came apart. And everything inside it, luggage, seats, cargo, 28 human beings, began to fall. Let me take you to a different perspective now. Far below, on the ground, in a small village in what is today the Czech Republic, a village called Srbska Kamenice, the day is beginning like any other winter day. Farmers are tending to their animals. A thin layer of snow covers the ground. The sky is overcast and gray. The villagers go about their morning routines, unaware that 6 miles above their heads, something unthinkable is happening. And then, debris begins to fall from the sky. Pieces of fuselage, luggage, seat cushions, personal belongings of 28 people scattered across miles of frozen forest and farmland. Villagers come out of their homes. They look up. They look around. They don't understand what they are seeing. And then, in the wreckage, one of the villagers, a man who had been a medic during World War II, finds something that stops him completely cold. He finds a body, but this body is different from the others, because this body has a pulse. I want to stop here and ask you something genuinely important, and I want you to answer in the comments below. If you fell from 33,000 feet, 6 miles up, what do you think would be the only factor that could possibly save your life? Is it the angle of the fall? The terrain below? Pure genetic luck? Something about the human body we don't fully understand? Or is it something else entirely? Something that science can't measure? Drop your answer below. Because as this story unfolds, I promise you, the real answer is going to surprise you. It surprised every scientist who studied this case, every aviation expert, every doctor who treated her. And it might change the way you think about survival itself. Vesna Vulović is rushed to a hospital in Prague. The doctors who receive her are not optimistic. That would be a generous way to put it. The more accurate way to put it is that the doctors who received her expected to be treating a corpse that was still technically breathing. Her injuries are catastrophic by any standard of medicine. She has a fractured skull, 3 broken vertebrae, one of which is completely crushed, leaving her temporarily paralyzed from the waist down. Both of her legs are broken. Her pelvis is fractured in multiple places. Several ribs are broken. She has severe internal injuries. She has lost enormous amounts of blood. The medical team does what they can. They operate. They stabilize. They manage. And then, they wait. Vesna spends several days in a coma. And here is the thing about a coma that most people don't think about. The person inside the coma, the person lying there with machines breathing for them, with tubes and monitors attached to every part of their body, they are somewhere. They are experiencing something. Or they are experiencing nothing. And nobody, not the doctors, not the family sitting vigil by the bed, nobody knows which one it is. Vesna's mother flies to Prague immediately. She sits beside her daughter's bed. And she waits. Days pass. The medical team gives cautious, careful updates. They don't make promises. They've learned not to make promises in situations like this. And then, 27 days after the crash, Vesna Vulović opens her eyes. When Vesna wakes up, the first thing she asks about is her passengers. Not herself. Not her injuries. Not where she is or what happened. She asks about the passengers. When she's told that everyone else on the flight has died, all 27 other people, the grief hits her in a way that her physical injuries somehow hadn't. She weeps. And according to accounts from hospital staff, she carries that grief with her for the rest of her life, even as she insists, loudly, publicly, defiantly, that she does not regret surviving. But here is what she does not know when she wakes up. She doesn't know the full story of how she survived. And when the investigators finally piece it together, when the aviation experts reconstruct what happened to her body during those 6 miles of freefall, even they struggle to explain it. Because what saved Vesna Vulović wasn't heroism. It wasn't training. It wasn't even luck in the conventional sense. It was a combination of factors so precise, so bizarrely specific, so almost impossibly coincidental, that the scientists studying her case used a word you almost never hear in aviation accident reports. They called it a miracle. And these were not religious men. These were engineers and physicists and medical doctors. They called it a miracle anyway. Now, let's talk about what actually happens to a human body that falls from 33,000 feet. Because understanding this is critical to understanding why Vesna's survival is so extraordinary. When you fall from extreme altitude, several things happen almost simultaneously. The air pressure at that height is so low that if you're exposed to it directly, without a pressurized cabin, your body begins experiencing hypoxia within seconds. Your blood oxygen drops. Consciousness fades. In fact, at 33,000 feet, an unprotected human being loses consciousness in approximately 30 to 60 seconds. So Vesna, if she was conscious at all after the aircraft broke apart, would have lost consciousness almost immediately. This is actually important. We'll come back to it. Now, the terminal velocity of a human body in freefall, the maximum speed a falling person reaches before air resistance prevents them from accelerating further, is approximately 120 miles per hour in a standard spread eagle position. In a more streamlined position, it can reach 200 miles per hour or faster. At 120 miles per hour, striking the ground is like hitting a wall of concrete. The human body is not designed for this. Every bone in the skeletal structure, every organ, every blood vessel, none of it is engineered to absorb that kind of impact force. So the question isn't just how did she survive the fall. The question is, how did her body, impacting at terminal velocity, not simply cease to function at the moment of contact? And this is where the story gets deeply strange. Part of the answer lies in where she landed. The village of Srbska Kamenaj sits in a region of Bohemia characterized by dense forest and, in January, a thick cover of snow. The trees in that area, tall, dense conifers, had branches that, depending on how a falling object struck them, could theoretically slow its descent. Not stop it, but slow it. And in the specific location where Vesna landed, the ground sloped downward, steeply. Which means that instead of hitting a flat surface at full terminal velocity, which is like hitting a wall, her body, in theory, may have impacted a surface that was angled relative to her trajectory. Physics will tell you that the difference between a flat impact and an angled impact can be significant when it comes to force distribution. But here's what the investigators kept coming back to. Those factors alone, the trees, the slope, the snow, were not sufficient to fully explain her survival. Not even close. Bodies had fallen in similar terrain in other crashes and not survived. There had to be something else. And there was. Before I tell you the most important piece of this puzzle, the piece that even today, decades later, generates serious scientific debate, I want to ask you something. Have you ever had a moment in your life where something went terribly, catastrophically wrong, and you survived it, and you couldn't fully explain why you survived? Maybe it wasn't a plane crash. Maybe it was a car accident, a medical emergency, a moment where by every logical measure, things should have gone much worse than they did. Tell me about it in the comments. Because what this story reveals about human survival, about the relationship between the body, consciousness, and the randomness of fate, is something that connects to every single one of our lives. Not just the extraordinary ones. All of us have a story where we're still here when we perhaps shouldn't be. This is Vesna's version of that story. And now I'm going to tell you the part that changes everything. Here it is. The investigators discovered something about the position of Vesna's body within the wreckage that fundamentally reframed the entire survival analysis. She did not fall freely. At the moment the aircraft broke apart, Vesna was in the rear of the fuselage, in a section of the plane that remained largely intact as a structural unit even as the rest of the aircraft disintegrated. She was trapped, unconscious, remember, from the hypoxia, within a section of the fuselage that essentially acted as a crude, terrible, chaotic cocoon. She wasn't a woman falling from the sky. She was a woman inside a piece of airplane that was falling from the sky. And that piece of airplane, specifically the rear section of the fuselage, hit the ground with enough integrity that it crumpled and absorbed some, not all, but some, of the impact force in a way that a free-falling human body never could. Now, the section still hit with enormous force. Her injuries confirm that. No one is saying she gently drifted to Earth. What the investigation established is that the structural characteristics of that particular fuselage section, combined with the angled, forested terrain, combined with the fact that she was unconscious, and therefore her body was completely limp rather than braced for impact, which actually reduces injury severity significantly, created a cascade of factors that, taken individually, none of them would have saved her. But stacked together, in exactly the sequence and combination that they occurred, they collectively produced the most improbable survival in aviation history. The unconscious part matters enormously. And this is something that trauma surgeons will confirm. A relaxed body absorbs impact differently than a tensed one. When people brace for impact, when they see the crash coming and tighten every muscle, that rigidity can paradoxically increase the severity of certain injuries. Vesna, unconscious at 33,000 feet, hit the ground with a body that offered no resistance. She was, in the most literal sense, fully surrendered to what was happening to her. There's something almost philosophical about that. A woman who survived precisely because she had no control. Vesna Vulović spends months in the hospital. The surgeons work on her legs, her spine, her pelvis. She undergoes multiple operations. The prognosis for walking again is, initially, considered unlikely. The vertebral damage alone should have resulted in permanent paralysis. It doesn't. Vesna Vulović not only regains consciousness, she regains mobility. Within months, she is walking, not easily, not without pain, not in the way she walked before, but walking, moving through the world on her own 2 feet. The medical team documents a recovery with the same speechless, slightly baffled quality that the aviation investigators brought to their crash analysis. They write their reports with clinical precision. But between the lines, you can feel the disbelief. They have nothing in their training, no precedent in their medical literature, that fully accounts for this woman's recovery trajectory. She is, eventually, discharged. And she goes home. And here is where this story takes a turn that I think says more about who Vesna Vulović was than any of the physics or biology ever could. Vesna goes back to work for Yugoslav Airlines. Now, I want you to sit with that for a moment. Most people, and this is not a judgment, this is a completely understandable human response. Most people who experience a single traumatic event with even a fraction of this severity never fully return to normal life. PTSD, anxiety, phobias, chronic pain. The psychological aftermath of serious trauma is documented, well understood, and profoundly real. Vesna Vulović walks back into an airport. She gets on airplanes. She does the job she was doing when her world exploded 6 miles above the Earth. When asked about this, and she was asked about it constantly for decades, she gives an answer that is so direct, so utterly without sentimentality or performance, that it stops you cold every time. She says she was never afraid of flying. Not before the crash. Not after the crash. She couldn't explain it herself. She had no memory of the fall. She had no memory of the impact. Her last memory before waking up in the hospital was serving drinks to passengers. And her first memory after the crash is waking up 27 days later, asking about her passengers. The 6 miles in between, gone, erased. A blank space in her personal history where the most extraordinary thing that has ever happened to a human being just isn't there. And maybe that's part of it. Maybe the absence of memory is its own kind of grace. She didn't have to live with the footage. She didn't have to replay the fall. The mind, in its own self-protective wisdom, simply didn't record it. Now we need to talk about the part of this story that most retellings skip over. Because the survival of Vesna Vulović, extraordinary as it is arguably not even the most disturbing part of the Flight 367 story. What destroyed that aircraft is. The official investigation concluded that the crash was caused by a bomb. Specifically, that Croatian nationalist extremists, members of a group called the Ustasha, had planted an explosive device in the cargo hold of the aircraft, set to detonate mid-flight. That is the official conclusion. But here is what was never fully resolved. The explosion that brought down Flight 367 occurred according to the radar data and the physical evidence, with almost no warning. No distress call was made. The crew had no time to react. This is consistent with a catastrophic, instantaneous structural failure, which a bomb would cause. But investigators in the years following the crash, including a pair of Czech journalists who published a deeply researched investigation in 2008, raised serious questions about whether the bomb explanation was correct. Their analysis of the physical evidence, combined with declassified documents and testimony from sources within the Czechoslovak intelligence services, suggested a radically different conclusion. They proposed that Flight 367 was not destroyed by a bomb planted by terrorists. They proposed it was shot down by mistake. Specifically, the Czechoslovak Air Defense, operating in a Cold War environment of extreme paranoia and hair-trigger military readiness, detected an unidentified aircraft flying over their territory and scrambled fighters to intercept it. And that in the confusion and chaos of Cold War military protocol, the aircraft was engaged before its identity was confirmed. JAT Flight 367, in this version of events, was destroyed by a missile. And the bomb narrative, which was officially accepted and which resulted in trials and convictions of Croatian nationalists, was constructed afterward to avoid an international incident of catastrophic diplomatic proportions. Now, I am not here to tell you definitively which version is true. What I am telling you is that the true cause of the crash that Vesna Vulović survived has never, to this day, been resolved to everyone's satisfaction. There are researchers and aviation historians who believe the official bomb investigation was thorough and accurate. There are others who find the Czech journalist's evidence deeply compelling. What everyone agrees on is that 28 people were on that plane, and that only one of them survived. Here's what I want to know from you in the comments. Does it change anything for you about Vesna's story, about how you feel about her survival, if the crash was caused by a military error rather than a terrorist act? And do you think governments have an obligation to tell the full truth about disasters like this, even decades later? This is not a rhetorical question. I genuinely want to know where you stand on this, because the intersection of political truth, historical accountability, and individual tragedy is something that affects real families, including the families of the 27 people who didn't survive Flight 367. Comment below. Let's talk about this. In 1985, the Guinness World Records formally recognizes her survival as the highest fall survived without a parachute in recorded human history. 33,333 feet. That is the number they give. A strange, almost eerie symmetry of threes. She holds that record to this day. Nobody has come close to matching it in documented, verified cases. The next closest comparable survivals involve significantly lower altitudes or substantially different circumstances. She is invited to speak, to appear on television programs around the world, to tell her story to audiences in dozens of countries. She does it, always with the same directness, the same absence of drama, the same refusal to perform amazement at her own survival. She is asked over and over whether she believes in God, whether she believes that some divine force intervened to save her. Her answer is characteristically blunt. She says she doesn't know. She says she has no explanation for why she is alive when 27 others are not. She carries the weight of that, the survivor's guilt, the randomness of it, the fact that her survival came from a clerical error in the first place, with a quiet, unflinching honesty that is more moving than any elaborate spiritual narrative could be. She doesn't claim to have a message. She doesn't claim to have been saved for a reason. She is simply here, unexpectedly, improbably, against every physical law that should have governed her fate. She is simply here. There is one more dimension to Vesna Vulović's life that deserves attention, because she is not only famous for surviving the fall in Yugoslavia in the 1980s and 1990s, as the country fractures, as nationalism tears apart the fabric of a society, as the wars begin, Vesna becomes something else. She becomes a public figure in a complicated, contested political landscape. She is celebrated as a national hero by some. She is viewed with suspicion and political instrumentalization by others. Her survival and her fame deployed in service of various narratives about Yugoslav identity, Serbian resilience, the heroism of ordinary people. She navigates this with the same directness she brings to everything else. When Slobodan Milosevic is in power and his government attempts to use her as a symbol of Serbian heroism to wrap her story in nationalist mythology, she refuses. In 1993, she publicly participates in demonstrations against the Milosevic government. She is fired from JAT Airlines as a result. A woman who survived a fall from 33,333 feet loses her job because she dared to hold up a sign at a protest. The absurdity of that, the sheer, almost darkly comedic disproportion of those two facts existing in the same life, says something profound about how political power works. How it will use your story when it serves the narrative, and punish you when you refuse to cooperate with the narrative. Vesna Vulović is not intimidated. She was not intimidated by 6 miles of open sky. She is certainly not intimidated by a government bureaucrat. Vesna Vulović lives out her later years in Belgrade, Serbia. She gives interviews. She keeps her sardonic, dry sense of humor fully intact. She is photographed and documented and studied and discussed. She receives visitors, researchers, journalists, curious people who just want to look at the face of a woman who should not be alive. She tells them what she always tells them. She remembers nothing. She has no wisdom to offer about death, because she never experienced death, not consciously, not memorably. She fell from the sky, and woke up in a hospital and lived her life. She is not a guru. She is not a prophet. She is a woman who had an extraordinary thing happen to her, who never fully understood why, and who made peace, imperfect, complicated, honest peace, with the unanswerable nature of it. On December 23, 2016, Vesna Vulović is found dead in her apartment in Belgrade at the age of 66. The cause of death is determined to be natural, a heart attack. There is no drama, no strange symmetry, just the ordinary end of an extraordinary life. She was 66 years old. She had lived 44 years beyond the moment every law of physics said she shouldn't have lived beyond. 44 years of coffee in the morning and television in the evening and conversations with friends and arguments about politics and all the beautiful, ordinary, mundane texture of a life being lived. 44 years she had no reason to expect. 44 years she spent being exactly and only herself, not a symbol, not a miracle, not a metaphor. Just Vesna, the woman who liked the Beatles, the woman who got on the wrong flight by accident, the woman who fell from the sky and lived. Here is the last question I want to leave you with today, and this one is personal. If you were given 44 unexpected years, 44 years that by every logic and reason you should not have had, what would you do with them? Would you travel? Would you fight for something? Would you spend them quietly, gratefully, just present in the ordinary moments that most of us take completely for granted? Vesna Vulović chose presence. She chose stubbornness. She chose honesty. She chose to refuse the narratives that powerful people tried to write around her story and to insist on being exactly who she was. Maybe that's the real lesson here. Not the physics. Not the miracle of her survival. Not the Guinness World Record. The lesson is what she did afterward. What we all do afterward. Because in one way or another, in ways far less dramatic and far less literal than Vesna's, every single one of us has survived something we didn't expect to survive. Every single one of us is living in time that, in one way or another, wasn't guaranteed. The question Vesna Vulovic's life asks all of us, quietly, without drama, with that same blunt and unadorned honesty she brought to everything, is simply this. What are you doing with it? If this story moved you, challenged you, or made you think, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for more stories like this one. And drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one of them. This has been the true story of Vesna Vulović, a woman who fell from the sky and lived.